I think, okay, so this is part two of why American slavery persisted. The first part, we went up to approximately, somewhat chronologically, up to approximately 1760, concluded with the introduction of the character Anthony Benezet, whose work we will run into again in this one. This class will deal with the Revolutionary period, right up to the period of the Constitutional Convention, not dealing with the Constitutional Convention. The next class will deal with the Constitutional Convention through up to the Jeffersonian period, and then I'm going to do 30 years, a 30-year sweep in the last class, which will be much less detailed, but necessarily so, and I have more work to do on that period, but I'll give you the overall idea. So let me start by sharing the screen, and we'll get to the slideshow, and the slideshow from beginning. And can you all see that? All right. Somehow I want to get this hide thumbnail. All right. So this is the period of upsurge into the revolution itself. And while some have argued that the revolution really started more than 100 years before, with the American colonies insisting on self-government, this is a period where we're headed toward war. And that is a significant escalation. And during this period, just to give you an overview, all the colonies but South Carolina and Georgia did try to outlaw slavery unsuccessfully. Some of that was the slave trade, some of it was the slave trade and slavery itself. But that is an overview of the sentiment that was building up at the time. Of course, as the colonists were resisting the clampdown from the British on their economic activity and their resistance to being taxed and being suppressed in numerous ways, politically, economically, they became great rhetoricians, and the subject of being enslaved very much came to the fore. This is the famous speech by Patrick Henry in 1775, but it's not at all unusual as to what was going on and being said in that period. Everyone was talking about the danger of being enslaved by a parliament and a king who would not provide them what they understood as their rights as Englishmen. So that obviously created a great dissonance in the minds of many, many of the American colonists, because they were living in a set of colonies where slavery had already been entrenched, to a greater degree in the South, a lesser degree, but significant in the North. The real shot across the bow on linking these issues really begins in 1761 with James Otis of Massachusetts. He is a lawyer who is fighting against the British writs of assistance. Many of you may be familiar with what those were. They were general search warrants that the British were imposing, that they could go into any house, any ship, any conveyance in order to see if there were goods that should be taxed that were being, where the owner was evading the tax. So he was in court saying this violated the rights of the colonists as British subjects, but he based his argument not on legalisms within the British system, but on natural law and what the rights of man should actually be to be free of that kind of oppression. And as he brought up that issue, he linked it to the violation of human rights and natural law in maintaining slavery. And I find this quote, when I first heard it, which was approximately a year and a half ago, to be quite surprising as to the thought at the time. But you see, start at the beginning. Is short curly hair something that should consign you to slavery? Every man becomes a petty tyrant who participates. And this was an argument in court. It was not the core argument. It was not followed up directly at that time by immediate action to try to eliminate slavery. But Otis did not just argue in court. He wrote a pamphlet and where he agitated in this way. Now, the next phase of the revolutionary struggle, as you will recall, was the Stamp Act, where the colonists were up in arms, literally, in order to prevent what they considered to be an unjust tax on them without their participation. And the colonists came together nationally for a united resistance against this activity. And the measures that they decided to take were non-importation, were to take economic retaliation against the British. We won't import anything of yours. And that included the slave trade. We will not import any slaves, despite the fact that that was a major element of the trade that was going on British ships coming across the Atlantic. So this was a broad general action, but it concluded when the Stamp Act was revoked. But the activity in these colonies did not end. In fact, it took off in an even more intense manner. One place where it did that was in Pennsylvania. We meet Anthony Benezet again, the Quaker from Pennsylvania, who has been teaching blacks students since the 1750s and agitating against slavery. He has started writing pamphlets back at that time. He did research on what was actually the situation in certain countries of Africa, like Guinea, refuting the idea that what was going on there was so atrocious that it was actually good to bring slaves out of Africa into this continent. But in 1766, he did a very extensive pamphlet that had international impact. You can see the title of it here. It was based upon his interviews with ship captains who had brought slaves to this country, and was therefore very graphic in terms of the calamitous state of what people were condoning or participating in by enduring slavery. Here are a couple quotes from there where he challenges his fellow citizens to, the point is not being lost on these leaders of the American Revolution, that you cannot adequately fight a tyrant abroad and continue to be tyrants toward the African race. You go. And the argument is made, contrary to what was said by those who defended slavery, that these were people, free by nature, endowed with the same rational faculties, and they are being literally murdered every year by this trade. That spread. Now, Benezet was born in France, but he really lived most of his life in Pennsylvania. He was a French Huguenot extraction, and but he was not a localist at all. He wasn't just talking about what was going on in Pennsylvania. He was writing and spreading his material as far and wide as he could. He was a collaborator with Benjamin Franklin and with those in England who were known as some of the leading abolitionists of that century. In particular, this fellow Granville Sharp, who wrote a significant book in 3 years after Benezet, 1769, attacking slavery and attacking Americans for condoning slavery. And he was inspired by Benezet, in fact, and carried out many of the rescues, legal attempts. He was a lawyer, as many of these leaders were, and he took cases to court to try to rescue the slaves who were being either re-enslaved, sent back to the colonies, or whatever. Benezet, as I said, was also heavily involved in education for blacks. He established his first one, I think, in 1758 in Philadelphia, but in collaboration with Franklin, they had a group called the Associates of Dr. Thomas Bray. We heard about him as a collaborator and supporter of Oglethorpe in the first class. And these schools were set up first in Philadelphia, and then at Franklin's suggestion, expanded to New York City, Williamsburg, Virginia, Newport, Rhode Island, and Fredericksburg, Virginia. None of the schools, the schools were held in houses. There really were no public schools at that time anywhere for whites or anybody. This was very active, and Franklin visited the schools and was duly impressed with his own previous ignorance about the intellectual potential of the black youth. Some were free, many of them were enslaved. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, there's a significant escalation to try to change the laws. The Samuel Adams, who was against slavery all his life, takes the initiative after the victory of the Stamp Act. There's tremendous excitement that they were able to roll this tax back, so why not proceed to do greater things? And he went to town meetings in collaboration with Otis and others to demand that their representatives put in legislation to end the slave trade and ultimately to end slavery itself. The House bill that was actually being debated in 1767 was crafted with this purpose, to prevent the custom of enslaving mankind in this province. You might be surprised it says the unusual practice. what they meant by that was that it was unnatural, that it was against natural law to do such a thing. So both the importation and slavery itself. That bill was not explicitly vetoed by the governor. The governor succeeded in getting it killed by ordering his council not to reconcile their bill with the House bill and therefore let it die, the so-called natural death. While that debate is going on, it's escalated by a contribution by this fellow, Nathaniel Appleton. He was the son of a very famous clergyman up there in New England, up in Massachusetts, and he writes a piece called Considerations on Slavery in a letter to a friend. And he again takes this on as a direct attack on those who would claim that we deserve freedom from slavery from Great Britain and aren't willing to free the slaves among us. Give you a little time to read these. I'm not going to read them out loud. But I'm assuming that you can see them. And Virginia is also the site of activity in this direction, from what you may consider surprising sources. People who were major slave holders, George Mason. I don't know about Arthur Lee being a major slaveholder, but he probably was. He was from a very significant family down here. Cousin of Richard Henry Lee, whom we will also see. But these people were writing very straightforward diatribes against the existence of slavery among them. And there was legislation that was put into the Virginia House of Delegates to try to put an expropriative tax on slave imports. This was considered it was considered a blow against slavery. It was not what you would hear mostly today was, oh, they just did it because they wanted to sell off the excess slaves here in Virginia. That had not begun yet, and this was it was seen as a move toward ending slavery itself. Fellow creatures created as ourselves. In all these places, just as we saw in Pennsylvania last week, in the early 18th century, when the Crown vetoed expropriative taxes against slave trade in Pennsylvania, you had vetoes in Massachusetts against legislation that would either ban this trade or slavery itself, Virginia, and Massachusetts again. Explicitly in many cases, because this was a major source of revenue for the Crown. Now, when we come to the early 1770s, things get even more intense. As you know, the conflict with Britain gets more intense as the taxation policy continues. As the Crown eliminates one tax, they add another tax, I'm not thinking of the name, but the broad powers to be able to compel the colonists to contribute more to the empire's wars, in effect. So, as the conflict between the colonists and the British Crown and Parliament escalates, Ben Franklin himself comes into directly to address the issue of freedom from slavery for the American colonies, freedom from slavery for the African slaves. And he writes a piece. I don't think I quoted this. No, I didn't. Let me just pretend you're still seeing Ben Franklin, because I'm going to. He writes a piece in the Public Advertiser in London, which is not titled. I mean, it's not signed. I mean, a lot of these people write all these things without signing their name, but they assume everybody knows who wrote them. And in this case, I'm sure they did know who wrote them. It's a dialogue between an American and an Englishman on the question of slavery. And it's called A Conversation on Slavery, published in January 1770. And so the conversation is between an Englishman, a Scotchman, and an American. And the subject is, are Americans more tyrants than the British because they continue to enslave Africans? And it starts off with the Englishman asking the American, Franklin, well, what do you think of Granville Sharp's book where he attacks Americans as being hypocritical tyrants? And Franklin says, well, in the main, I think it's good. I'm pleased with the humanity. But I really think that you can't have such a general condemnation of the Americans. Why, there's a great, as having a tyrannical disposition, there's a great difference between how much slavery there is in many parts of the country. Many Americans are totally against it, and so forth and so on. And he says, and he elaborates on that. And then he says, and it's clearly bad, but the people who have slaves in the American colonies bought them from people who stole them, you Englishmen, who stole them from Africa. So yes, you can say that someone who buys stolen goods knowing they're stolen goods is evil, and stolen men is even worse than stolen goods. But no one ever said that you could let the thief off the hook, right, for your part in actually carrying this out. And he's asked about the laws against slaves being so draconian, and he says, well, that may be, but, some of these people are very, have been very violent, and if they had a revolt, they wiped out everybody and so forth. So maybe we have to be like that. And then he turns the tables and says, but you also have slaves. So what do you mean? He said, well, you have, look at what a slave is. Define a slave. If I could find this easily, I would. A slave is someone who has no freedom to leave his job. A human creature stolen, taken by force, bought of another or of himself with money, and being so taken or bought is compelled to serve during pleasure or during life. He may be sold again, let for hire, and obliged to serve that other, and follow all the commands. And this is, he's dependent upon him for his food, for everything. He's punished enormously if he disobeys, and this, he claims, is rather the condition of the Scots working in mines, but in particular to English sailors and soldiers. They follow that description. They're often kidnapped. They're sold to others to carry out their activity, and they're ordered to kill people. Said aren't allowed by law to order slaves to kill people. Anyway, it's not what I would call the most noble argument, but it indicates the kind of debate that is going on at the time. That he feels he has to address it, number one, and how he attempts to turn the tables on the British. Now, it gets very hot in the 1772 period because of the Somerset case. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is a fellow by the name of James Somerset, who was in England and escaped slavery, and then his master showed up and tried to kidnap him and bring him back to the American colonies. And Granville Sharp took up his case, and he succeeded in getting it heard by the top judicial mind of England at the time. Lord Mansfield, I believe is the name. And Mansfield is very careful about what he says, but he makes a ruling that a Briton cannot be kidnapped back into slavery, which is what this guy was going to do. But the ruling is such, and it frees this guy, James Somerset, but the ruling is such that it's interpreted as meaning there's no slavery legal in Britain, and therefore there shouldn't be any slavery legal in the British colonies, and therefore the slaves should be freed. So this greatly increases the agitation toward liberating the slaves. It's debated all over the U.S. colonies. Mansfield really is unhappy because, there was slavery in England, contrary to what they say. It wasn't the kind of slavery we have had in the plantations and here, but it did exist. And a lot of these owners of the plantations here in the colonies were actually British. They hired people to do it here, to manage things here. So it's not as though, anybody in England really wanted this to say end slavery, but it really spurred things on. And then the second thing in 1772 that did the same thing was the Phyllis Wheatley sensation. You may be familiar. She was an enslaved girl who came by herself in 1761, and she was a prodigy. She became a poet, and her poetry became known and was highly praised. It was patriotic poetry, including praises of George Washington and the revolutionary activity. And it became such a sensation that there were many people who said, well, this is impossible. She couldn't have written these poems because she's an enslaved person from Africa. Africans, come on, they can't create poetry. So they actually set up a trial of 12 prominent people, including at Harvard and so forth, who interviewed Phyllis Wheatley and came to the conclusion that she definitely did and could have written these poems. And this became very widely known, very widely debated, and was a significant undercutting of one of the major arguments in favor of slavery. So more could be said about that, but we have to get through the whole period, I think. There continue to be more laws proposed in Virginia, in Massachusetts, to try to block the slave trade. These are blocked, continue to be blocked by the royal governors throughout. And the literary opposition escalates as well. So you've got Benjamin Rush joins the fray in 1774. He's the noted doctor from Philadelphia. This is anonymous again, but it's an address to the inhabitants of the British settlements that takes on the idea again that there's anything, that is substandard in the intellect of Negroes, taking that away, that argument. He attacks this idea that only blacks can work in the tropics, that the Bible sanctions slavery, and demands that there be action, but it's mostly action that by individuals, to free their slaves. This brings us into the first period of the First Continental Congress, where again you have moves toward trying to force the British to rescind their taxation policy. There's a threat given by the Continental Congress that if you don't accede to our demands, that we will cut off, we'll have a non-importation agreement that then goes ahead, and there is a banning of slavery. The spirit going into that, it's interesting to note, that is actually reflected in what Jefferson's views were at the time. He says that this was the case. So the slave trade is totally banned from the First Continental Congress. And interestingly, I found an article which documents the fact that it wasn't just slave trade with Britain, it was any participation in the slave trade. And the Congress actually set up enforcement rules to prevent people from merchants from having anything to do with commerce in slaves in this period. Now it didn't pretend to free the slaves that were here, but the slave trade, not just international, but also what merchants were involved with here, was to be ended. This is the period where the first abolition society is established, the Pennsylvania one, 1775. That's really at the instigation of Anthony Benezet. This is their emblem. It's not really aimed, it's aimed mostly at amelioration of the conditions of slaves, but that is what they, it's the first society to that effect, and to end the trade. And then we get to the war, because then you have in 1775, you have the outbreak of hostilities. And from the very beginning, there were significant numbers of blacks fighting for the colonists, as many as 3 dozen at Bunker Hill, for example. And when Washington arrives up there in Massachusetts, he is confronted with this fact. It's a fact on the ground. And what is he going to do about it? Because the Congress does not authorize this. Ultimately, within a few months, he accedes to the facts on the ground and the fact that they need the manpower, and the experience shows that it works. For a little bit later, of course, there's another spur for allowing the blacks to participate, which is the action by Governor Dunmore. This is the Virginia governor. He's in a rough spot. He's been in a fight against support for Boston in Virginia for a couple years before this. Now it's coming to a shooting war. He's in trouble. He issues a proclamation in November of 1775 saying, any slaves who want to leave the rebels to join the British cause will be granted their freedom. Not the slaves that have worked for the Loyalists. If you're a slave for the Loyalists and want to join the army, forget it. You stay and do your job. But for the rebels, you should do that. He does succeed, obviously. That's a big incentive in recruiting somewhere between, they estimate 800 blacks to join his Ethiopian regiment. I read a little more about this week, and it appears that what actually happened is that this regiment didn't really last very long because Dunmore had a great deal of difficulty. He was losing his war, including with these reinforcements, and ended up moving to an island off Virginia and then going to New York, escaping to New York. And when he was on the island off Virginia, there was disease, and apparently hundreds of these members of the Ethiopian regiment died. So really only 300 went with him to New York. This was not an overall policy of the British command. It was a Virginia policy, and in fact, it was in, I think it was Gage, who was the head at that point, issued an order shortly after, in 1777 or something, saying any blacks in the army should be kicked out. There continued to be militias, there continued to be special forces, and so forth and so on. They estimate, over 10,000 blacks joining the British side. The figures given for the American side are 5,000, but I think that has to be that number one. It's the Continental Army. It doesn't include militias. I have reports, evidence from scholars who indicate that 3,000 Haitians were fought on the side of the Revolution in the South. So it's not possible that it was only 5,000, but what the heck. There was a lot of support in the black community for the revolution. There were mixed units, not just black units. And I want to give you just a brief idea of this fellow, this other voice going into the Second Continental Congress, Samuel Hopkins, a Rhode Island Congregationalist minister. He writes a letter to the Continental Congress as it is convening. And it is, as said here, a dialogue on the slavery of Africans, showing it to be the duty and interest of the American states to emancipate all their African slaves. Very straightforward. And we look to you on behalf of the more than 500,000. And this again is a dialogue. I will definitely send out the link to this for you. You will find it very interesting. And it goes, it's a dialogue between someone defending the continuation of slavery and the person who wrote it. saying, no, this has to be ended. So this was the mood going into the, from significant people. This is a prominent minister, prominent and therefore political figure in New England, who issues this letter. So that brings us into the Second Continental Congress and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which, as you know, has been a matter of great controversy on the question and of what it actually represents in terms of a blow for freedom, particularly in the recent period, but also throughout our history, because the fight very much came to the fore in just prior to the Civil War, with the South insisting that, like some of the abolitionists, that the opening declaration did not include African Americans, and the other side insisting that it did. So the Declaration is actually more than one part. Like the Constitution, it starts with a statement of principle. In the Constitution, we have a preamble, and then we have the specifics of how it's laid out. The way I see the Declaration, as some others do, is it starts with the statement of principle, which is the core of which is what we all know, that all men are created equal, and the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, and the rest of it is the Bill of Indictment, which is not statements of principle, and then the conclusion of the Declaration of Independence itself. So a lot is made out of the fact that one of the bills of indictment on slavery was removed. This is the item that was removed, which attacks the British for having brought slavery to the land and for having prostituted their negative to suppress legislative attempts to stop it, prohibit it, or stop it. Now that is true. I mean, people have mocked that, saying, well, you know, it was the responsibility of the Americans to end it, but it is definitely true that, as we've seen, that over and over again, the governors actually denied the colonists' right to do that. This was not defeated in committee. The committee that, I won't go through who was on the committee right now if you want to bring that up later, because I've taken a little longer than I expected. The committee included it, but Jefferson wrote it. The committee that he was responsible to included it. It was killed in the general body, and because they considered it controversial to characterize slavery in this way. The way that I view the Declaration is like Abraham Lincoln did. And this is just one of the many, many summaries that he made of the way in his debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858. He, of course, argued that it was intended to include all men. Of course, it did not at the time, but they meant simply to declare the right so the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. As he argued, everyone thought slavery was on its way out, meant to set up a standard maxim labored for everywhere. Now, in the aftermath, as the war proceeded, there is a specific black regiment set up in Rhode Island, 1778. This is the famous one. As I said, blacks were not necessarily all in separate units, but this one was apparently quite notable in its military activity. You had a famous case of John Lawrence, a close associate of Alexander Hamilton, putting forward the desire for a 3,000-man black army, recruiting slaves in South Carolina and offering them their freedom to fight for the Revolution. That was approved in Washington, but rejected by the South Carolinians. And then you began to have, in this period, even before the war ended, establishments of constitutions of the colonies now becoming states. And these do make significant moves in the direction of abolition. Vermont is the first constitution in 1777. No male person ought to be holden by law to serve as a servant, slave, or apprentice. And they're not eliminating indentured servitude, but they are eliminating slavery. And other states begin. Pennsylvania, when it does its constitution. Massachusetts, Massachusetts does not explicitly mention slaves, but its statement of the freedoms of its residents is used by the court in 1783 to free a slave, so it is considered to have banned slavery. As you may be aware, there were also restrictive laws in some of the colonies against slaves being able to be freed by their masters. They were not fully, people who owned slaves were not free to do whatever they wanted. And Virginia was one of those. Up until 1782, it was illegal for a slave master to free his slaves without getting special permission from the legislature and making some argument for some reason. 1782, that was removed, and it did begin to result in a lot of manumissions. The northern South free black population went from 1% to 10% over the upcoming 10 to 20 years. Connecticut and Rhode Island abolished slavery, and the number of free blacks rises significantly. In New York, you have the establishment of the New York Manumission Society, 1785, with John Jay, the president. These are very prominent people. The vice president is Alexander Hamilton. Their purpose is here, given to all men equal right to life, liberty, and property. Regard with compassion, but endeavor by all lawful ways and means to enable them to share equally with us civil and religious liberty. So this society does attempt to get the New York State legislature to ban slavery. That does not happen until 1799. But in the meantime, they agitate to prevent kidnappings, to aid slaves, and to liberalize the conditions. They also establish a school, African Free School, in 1787, which exists up until I think the 1840s when it merges with the New York public school system. And it educates both enslaved and free blacks, and was considered to be a major boon to to creating the civil rights and abolition leaders of the 19th century. And the education here was not, I mean, a lot of the education earlier that we were talking about was in the Bible. This, learn to read, learn to do, read for those purposes. Here, it was not confined at all to that. It very much related to trade, but it also but for the boys, they actually included astronomy. So this was not a dumbed down education for those who were considered inferior. Then in this period, the Pennsylvania Society expands its mission specifically to promote the abolition of slavery, whereas before it was talking about the relief of free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage. They always said it was unlawful, but now they decided to take it on more directly and attempt to get to ameliorate the law that was passed, the constitutional provisions, because when the gradual liberation laws were passed, they were hardly what you would consider to be liberal freedoms. They would have all sorts of conditions and so forth. So they moved to liberalize that. They moved to provide for people who were freed economically, education, and so forth. And then, of course, you have the Northwest Ordinance activity against slavery. Now, there were 3 attempts to do the Northwest Ordinance. One was 1784, 1785, and then 1787. Jefferson is credited with the first one, and it's interesting to note that Jefferson, who by this time was really beginning to back away from any desire to act against slavery, was proposed that it be banned starting in 1800. And apparently, from what I've read, even James Madison, hardly a radical on these issues, said that's ridiculous. If you allow slavery to entrench itself up to the year 1800, you're never going to get rid of it then. So they kept working on this and working on it, and ultimately did pass the ordinance which banned slavery in all this territory, which I think ended up, the states of Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, all involved in that. And by the time that we head into the Constitutional Convention, which is where I propose we begin the next time, the situation has advanced to the following point, where you actually had the ability of blacks to vote in all of these states. Now, there were property restrictions. We were by no means a general democracy, and obviously it would be harder for blacks and women to own property than it would be for those for others. But this is the only explicit laws against black suffrage were in Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia. So we were on the cusp of a rather potentially radical change in the positive direction, in my view, when we come into the convention. And that is what I got.
Awesome.
Marcy.
Yes,
Everyone can unmute as far as I'm concerned now.
Yeah.
If you wish.
Yeah, I guess I was just looking at Virginia's role. It seems very confused. They have laws that allow Blacks to be free, but they don't allow property owners to vote. I mean, they seem to be kind of undecided, right? Whereas the other ones are incrementally improving the rights of the former enslaved people. Is that your perception as well?
In Virginia?
Yeah, Virginia seems baffling.
Virginia, Virginia was a real had a real oligarchy, and I've looked at it quite a bit because I've studied the interventions of Federalists in Virginia, particularly a fellow by the name of Charles Fenton Mercer. And one of his major fights was on the franchise, because the way it was set up was for property owners in the Tidewater area to have more representation in the legislature. The representation was not based upon population, one man, one vote. It was based upon your property, right? And therefore, the white population was heavily disenfranchised, right? Along with the blacks, I mean, worse for the blacks, obviously, but there was no kind word for poor whites in Virginia. And in fact, the period of the 1870 Constitution of Virginia under Reconstruction really liberalized everything for whites and blacks. And then there was a reaction formation against that, and the 1905, that was 1870, the 1905 Constitution of Virginia cut the white voting population at least in half, along with disenfranchising all the blacks. Not literally, only if they passed all these tests, which you're familiar with, and so forth and so on. So in Virginia was an oligarchy against both, against anybody who would challenge the wealth and privilege of that class. So, Barbara, did I answer your question about Dunmore?
Yeah, that was an interesting occurrence, but I have another question. I was wondering if the banning of the slave trade in the 1700s occurred because the powers that be realized that domestic procreation could be depended on to supply the demand for slaves.
I believe that happened later in the game, later in the process. I haven't looked exactly at the slave importation stops, comes very much down in, I believe, at the end of that, actually at the end of the 18th century, before it's officially banned. And then the growth of the population by procreation is really in the early part of the, starts in really in the early part of the 19th century. But in terms of intent, from everything I've read, the intent was heavily to get rid of slavery. I do have a quote from Mason somewhere where, but I don't have it in front of me. He's a Virginian, so that would be significant. But I'm going to rely on my friend, Frederick Douglass, whom I will be talking about at length next week, because I've just reread his major article in defense of the Constitution against the Garrisonites, who said it was a pact with the devil. And he said that his view was, like Lincoln's, that people thought that getting rid of the trade would dry up slavery. And from reading what people say, certainly an awful lot of people thought that. Whether all of them did or not, I don't know. There may be some people who were thinking ahead, but I don't think there was a situation of a huge excess of slaves, which is what they attribute this intent to, that all of a sudden there were more slaves than there was work, and therefore they went to exporting the slaves internally, and then making money by exporting more slaves internally, to the West. That was, I don't believe that occurred until the beginning of the 19th century, because prior to that time there wasn't this huge excess, so-called, of slavery. But I would put great weight on what Frederick Douglass and Lincoln have to say about that intent. And certainly among these people like Benezet and Hopkins and the New Englanders, the intent was clearly as a first step to get rid of slavery.
Nancy, I saw that Karen Adams had her hand up, and then Barbara Bergman.
Oh, I can't see everybody. I don't have.
Okay, Karen Adams was next.
Yeah, we've all heard horrific tales of treatment of slaves by their masters, beatings and whippings and rape and so forth. In your research, did you run across many examples of masters treating their slaves with any kind of dignity or respect, or was it just expected and commonplace to keep them in line, so to speak, by treating them very, very badly?
I think it varied enormously. I have not concentrated on that aspect of slavery because everybody else is concentrating on that aspect of slavery, and I fully believe that slavery is an abomination, and that people were, if the master had the freedom to do that, then it sort of depended upon the master and who he hired. And the masters did, well, by law, they were restricted in certain ways. But the law really, did the law reach to the inside the plantation? I doubt it, and who they hired and as an overseer makes a difference, and whether the person was living in the uh, living in the house, you know, as a house servant, so-called, or not makes a difference. So I haven't really looked at that aspect of it. I'm sure that it was that it varied greatly and that a lot of that excess happened. A lot of that horrible stuff happened. And it certainly happened on the ships on the way over here. You know, it's certain, you know, there was no regard for person in terms of when everybody was, I mean, they didn't pick out certain people to be nice to or something like that. Uh, so, yeah, but the argument was they're less than human, right? And which is why I put stock in the argument. And clearly, the people who were anti-slavery made that a major point of attack. These are not less than human. They're, you know, we can educate them. People who haven't had access to education. Their intellect is as good as ours. One of the major problems of Jefferson was he could not face the fact that blacks had the same intellectual capability that white people did. I mean, he never came around to that. He said in the Notes of Virginia, well, I'm not convinced, you know, that I mean, some people say their environment has made life very difficult and therefore, you know, why do they have an incentive to learn and what, you know, that they've been treated as brutalized. They've been brutalized. So people, that has an effect on people. One person who was very strong on that kind of argument was Benjamin Rush, which he applied to the mentally ill as well. He was a crusader against inhuman treatment of the mentally ill, saying a lot of what, and also the argument with African Americans, saying if you can't judge what someone's potential is if you've treated them like a dog, right?
Yeah.
So, but Jefferson, brilliant man supposedly, but he would not concede that that was the case, and therefore that fed into his continuous attitude, which is slavery is a horrible thing, but we can't do a thing about it, and we really should not. We shouldn't agitate on the issue.
Yeah.
And Barbara had a Barbara Bergman.
Yes, this is a little bit from what you began talking about, how people were made to realize the potential of people who happen to be Black because of certain prodigies that were brought up. And one of them you mentioned was Phyllis Wheatley. I grew up in the Midwest and was interested in social work when I was in college. And I know one of our community centers was the Phyllis Wheatley Settlement
Oh,
Home.
really? Oh, great.
But the interesting thing is that there was never any that I know of pictures or poems or anything about her.
Really?
I never even knew that she was Black until you said that. And one of the reasons I took this class was because I am trying to in my own life become more open to our citizens in our country who happen to be Black. I feel like a lot of times we've been brought up so separate, and even living here farther in the South, I haven't really made a lot of close, well, I don't know that I've made many close Black friends. And I think it's partly that there's a need for us to learn more about in the past.
Uh-oh, you're frozen.
How things
Sounds like she's frozen.
We lost her.
Yeah. You want to just, Sean has a question. Maybe we can get back to Barbara when she comes back in.
Okay.
I've got to a question. Philip Wheatley apparently made a
Can you
call.
come closer to your microphone, Sean?
Phyllis Wheatley apparently was invited to Washington's headquarters in Boston and was received just like a white woman would have been received, which was amazing thing for someone like Washington coming from where he did at that time, particularly. And there's a letter someplace I've seen that he wrote to her, a note or something like that. And,
It's very hard to hear you. Can you?
oh, I'm sorry. George Washington apparently wrote a note to Miss Phyllis Wheatley, which was unheard of in those days.
Right.
Washington was not exactly, touching feeling type at all, and yet she wrote a poem about him, I think. And
Yeah, she wrote a very adulatory poem about him.
very interesting. And she was adopted when she came off the ship.
Right.
A white couple who taught her to read and write, which in many states was against the law to teach blacks to read and write.
Well, it actually was not. It was discouraged, but it didn't actually become illegal in many places until much later.
This was unusual. Anyway, apparently she was.
Yeah, it was unusual, very unusual, which is probably why they let everybody know about it. We have this prodigy here that.
Yeah. The only other thing I'd comment on was the blacks in the military at that time. Washington was really taken aback when he got to Boston to take over command at all these black people in the military. And he got to live with it. And the other thing, that regiment from Rhode Island was what saved his bacon after the Battle of Brooklyn, when the British wiped the streets with the U.S. people. They escaped. They were able to take at night all the surviving Americans across the river to New York City.
No, it wasn't them. They didn't come into existence until 1778, and that happened in 1776. So
Marblehead Regiment had a
Marblehead, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. But there were definitely in the Massachusetts regiments, they were integrated, right? Yeah. And I've read places where there were Virginia militia I mean, think of the militia, right? We did have a lot of militia in the Revolution, as well as regular Continental Army, and people picked up their guns and fought, and they were, in many cases, they were integrated. Yeah. So, but you can't overstate that. I mean, the question is, creating then a legal basis for eliminating the scourge of slavery, and people were trying to figure out how to do it, and the biggest, how to do it against opposition, and how to do it against what they perceived as the problems. In many places you couldn't free they made rules that if you manumitted your slaves, you had to put up money to support them if they weren't able to get a job, which was unfortunately quite possible under the conditions that existed. So that would be a big problem, and people worked, and of course, the longer the slave tradition, the slaveocracy continued, and the more slaves there were, the more difficult it was, because it became more accepted as part of life, right? And this people are people of habit, right? The revolutionaries in this country were a small percentage of the people in this country. they were not the majority. And people tend to go with what, let's not cause trouble.
Well,
And
look at George Washington's efforts when it was life, free his slaves. It was he didn't tell anybody. He wrote that code, the thing to his will. All never told Martha or anyone else until he died. Then it came out, and he did provide, and he was very. There still is a remnants down around Alexandria of places that he gave land to the slaves. I mean, but he had to do it in secret because he would get involved in legal problems with his own family, and not mind what the neighborhood would say.
yeah, and he also put in there, and no one is to violate this provision of my will. he was quite concerned that it was going to be controversial,
With good reason.
and it was, obviously.
I don't know, did Barbara, you want to come back? We lost you there about halfway through your discussion.
There, I don't really have too much more to say, just that it is an example of how studying some of these things in history, we can learn more about the how to respect people more. And I'm going to have more respect now for Black poets, because I found out there was this poet that community centers were named for in the Midwest, but nobody ever educated us about the person behind the name.
I think I read an article about that, but I don't know where it was. I don't know. I mean, I didn't mention, which I should have probably, but the fact that of what was going on in the free Black community. There were a whole series of petitions that were circulated up in Massachusetts among the free Black community on the legislature demanding an end to slavery. That was in the period going up into the Revolution. And there was also in the period after the Revolution, in the 1780s, is when the African Methodist, when the Black churches really began to be established and take an active political role in Pennsylvania. Benjamin Rush was a big supporter of the founder of the AME Zion Church and so forth. And of course, the reason that they ended up having to establish that church was because of unconscionable racism by the church they were going to. But they just walked out, and established their own church and established their own voice. So there was an independent, it's not as though, I mean, one of the big points of controversy these days is to say, that what was done to end slavery was all by white people. Well, it clearly was not. To the extent possible, there was also action, political action by free Blacks, and then there were revolts. I mean, there were incredible revolts I'd heard nothing about. There was one in New York City that lasted more than 10 years in the early part of the 18th century. But revolts, military revolts, did not succeed, right? In that as a method to shift the situation. But the people who were that I've been fighting about, we're thinking of it from the standpoint of creating rules for a society where this would be eliminated and opportunity would be available to all. So, is there anything else? I will set out, I will put together the Hopkins, the Franklin, the Appleton, and maybe a couple from the first class that you might be interested in reading, just to get a flavor of what the debate was, because there was such an active debate. I mean, I always thought that it really started in the 1830s. No, I mean, it started very soon after the founding very soon after the introduction of slavery started. Talking about it morally, talking about it economically, and talking about it politically. And there was, and people struggled with how they would be able to do it without ripping. Well, at this point, they're not talking about ripping the country apart. They're trying to pull it together because the country doesn't exist yet, but soon it will. So do you want to call it a day if no one else has anything more?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was good.
I do hope you are finding it informative.
Yeah, there's always something new to learn.
Yeah, well, I certainly have learned a lot looking at it because the things that I didn't know were there.
I
So,
think Barbara Bergman has another question, Nancy, before you start.
sure.
Barbara, you're muted.
There, I think I'm here on now. I just wanted to give a suggestion and see how other people felt about it. Can you hear me okay now?
Mhm.
Okay,
Yes.
good. I really like it if I can hear things that are quoted with my ears and not just with my eyes. Maybe I'm a person that enjoys learning from hearing besides from reading things. And I noticed that your quotes are usually pretty small. So it's not like that people would have to read a page or two or something of your quotes, but I wondered if other people would enjoy it too, if we had someone that would actually read what those quotes were rather than just have the silence and us try to read them ourselves. So what's your opinion about that?
I'm certainly willing to read it if you wish. I mean, there was one class I gave where somebody was a real speaker and agreed to read it dramatically, but the person, I'd be happy to read dramatically because I know what I think is to be emphasized in these particular quotes. But if other people don't mind, that's okay with me. We probably would have had time. That would have taken an extra 7 minutes or whatever. So I'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Constitution. This is Constitution Week, but we're discussing the Constitution next week.
Thank
Okay,
you. Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Nancy.
Bye.